It started with her teasing me about the sweat on my skin, and ended with me realizing she wasn't just watching, she was seeing me in a way no one else ever had. The afternoon sun was relentless, the kind of heat that pressed down on your shoulders until even the simplest task felt like a workout. I had been carrying a stack of grocery bags from my car, trying to balance them all in one trip like I always did, stubborn against common sense. Sweat trickled down my temple, catching in the corner of my jaw as I set the bags down on my porch with a sigh. And that's when I heard her voice. "You're sweating." It wasn't said in a judgmental way, not even really concerned. It was playful, teasing, like she'd been waiting for the right moment to throw it out there. I looked up, and there she was, my neighbor. She stood leaning against her porch railing across the narrow stretch of yard that separated our houses. She wasn't dressed up, just casual shorts and a loose blouse, but she carried herself with that effortless grace only some people seem to have. She held a glass of iced water in her hand, condensation sliding down its side, and her lips curved into a half-smile that made me forget for a second how hot I actually was. I swiped at my forehead with the back of my arm and tried to cover my flustered laugh. "Maybe stop staring like that." The words slipped out before I could think. Half a joke, half a defense, and a whole lot braver than I actually felt. Her smile didn't falter. If anything, it deepened. She tilted her head, amused, like she found my reaction far more entertaining than she should. "Fair enough," she said softly, lifting her glass to her lips. Something about the way she sipped, calm and unhurried, made me realize she wasn't in any rush to look away. And suddenly I became aware of everything: the cling of my shirt to my back, the heaviness of the summer air, the sound of a cicada buzzing somewhere overhead. It should have been a throwaway moment, the kind of neighborly interaction you laugh off and forget. But as I carried the bags inside, I found myself grinning, not at what I'd said, but at the fact that she'd been watching me at all. Inside, the cool air from the ceiling fan barely helped. I leaned against the counter and let the groceries sit, my mind still circling back to that smile across the porch. I had seen her around plenty of times before, watering her plants in the mornings, carrying in her mail, sometimes waving politely as we passed. But this was different. The way she said it, the way her eyes lingered, it wasn't just neighborly small talk. It was sharper, warmer, alive with a kind of quiet mischief. I caught myself wondering things I probably shouldn't. How long had she been standing there? Did she watch me often? And why did it feel like she saw more than just the sweat on my face? Later that evening, when the heat finally began to lift and the neighborhood settled into its soft, golden hour, I stepped outside again just to breathe in the cooler air. My gaze, almost without permission, drifted across to her porch. She wasn't there anymore. But the impression of her stayed, the curve of her smile, the playful tone of her voice, the way my chest had tightened at her teasing. It was only a few words, exchanged under the weight of the summer sun. But it felt like the start of something I couldn't quite name yet, a door quietly opening, if only by an inch. And though I told myself it was nothing, I knew deep down that I'd be waiting for the next time she decided to speak first. I thought the moment would fade. A neighbor's playful remark, nothing more. But it didn't. It stuck with me, replaying in quiet moments, the teasing lilt in her voice, the way her gaze lingered, as if she was looking a little deeper than most people dared. For the rest of that hot afternoon, I caught myself glancing out the window more times than I cared to admit. Her porch was empty, her blinds half drawn, the kind of subtle mystery that leaves you restless without reason. I told myself I was overthinking. She was just being friendly, maybe amused by the sight of me trying not to collapse under grocery bags. But the thought of her smile, steady, unhurried, had a weight I couldn't shake. It was the following evening when our paths crossed again. The day had cooled just enough that the air carried that soft, forgiving warmth, the kind that makes you want to linger outside instead of hiding from the heat. I had stepped out to water the little row of plants by my porch when her voice caught me off guard. "You work too hard out here," she said. I turned, and there she was again. This time, not leaning on her railing, but walking across the strip of grass between our houses. In her hand, she carried 2 tall glasses of iced tea. For a second, I just stared, not at the glasses, but at her. She looked effortlessly put together, the kind of natural beauty that didn't need effort to be noticed. A loose braid draped over her shoulder, her blouse soft against the fading sunlight, and that same small smile curving her lips. Before I could say anything, she extended one glass to me. Condensation beaded along its surface, slipping down over her fingers. Thought you could use this. I took it, careful not to let my hand brush hers, though the temptation to linger on that touch was stronger than I expected. Still, even in avoiding it, my fingers grazed her skin. Just for a second. Enough for my chest to tighten. Thanks, I said, maybe a little too quickly. She tilted her head, studying me like she was trying to read between the lines of a book. You're welcome. We ended up standing there longer than either of us probably intended, sipping the cold tea and watching the streets slip into twilight. The world seemed to hush around us. The hum of distant traffic softened, cicadas gave way to the rhythmic chirp of crickets. She talked about her garden, how the tomatoes this year weren't thriving the way she'd hoped, how the roses seemed to take on a life of their own. I listened, nodding, though part of me was more focused on the way her voice dipped and rose, calm yet quietly vibrant. When I mentioned my work, she asked thoughtful questions, not just to fill the silence but to understand. And in between those moments, there were stretches of quiet, not awkward but charged. I'd catch her eyes lingering, just as mine did, as though each pause was its own kind of conversation. At one point, when she gestured toward her garden, her fingers brushed mine again as she took the glass back. This time, either of us moved quickly. The contact lingered just long enough to spark something, not quite spoken, not yet admitted, but undeniably present. She smiled, softer now. Neighbors should look out for each other, don't you think? I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry despite the iced tea. Yeah, I managed, holding her gaze longer than I should have. I think so. As the last slant of golden light faded, she excused herself, carrying the empty glasses back toward her porch. And just before she disappeared inside, she glanced over her shoulder. One last look, one last smile that felt like an invitation, though I couldn't quite define to what. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sensation of her fingers brushing mine, the cool taste of tea lingering on my tongue, and the warmth of her gaze echoing in the quiet of my chest. It wasn't just neighborly kindness. It was something else, something that felt like the start of a question neither of us had dared to ask yet. It was late one evening when our conversation stretched past small talk and into something heavier. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops, and the neighborhood had settled into that quiet, hushed rhythm where even the breeze seemed reluctant to disturb the stillness. I was out by the fence, pretending to tidy up the stray weeds along the edge of my yard, when she came out with a mug of tea in her hand. Her porch light glowed soft amber, casting her in a warm halo that made her look both serene and impossibly untouchable. Still working? She asked, her voice carrying easily across the short distance. Just avoiding going inside, I admitted, dropping the pretense of looking busy. She smiled faintly, then walked over, tea cradled in both hands. Mind if I join you? I shook my head, moving aside as if I needed to make space, even though there was plenty of room already. She leaned against the fence, the wood cool under her hands, her shoulders relaxing as she exhaled. For a while, we just stood there. The night air was rich with the scent of cut grass and jasmine from her garden. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then fell quiet. Then, almost out of nowhere, she spoke. You know, sometimes I wonder what I'm even doing with my life anymore. The words caught me off guard. Not because of their meaning, but because of how openly she said them. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her gaze was fixed on the stars just beginning to prick through the dark sky. I stayed quiet, sensing she wasn't done. My kids are grown, busy with their own lives. Work is steady, predictable, maybe too predictable. And then I come home to this house, this porch, this garden. It's all fine. More than fine, actually. But sometimes. She broke off, shaking her head lightly as though laughing at herself. Sometimes it feels like I'm just waiting. For what, I couldn't tell you. There was a vulnerability in her tone that I hadn't heard before. The confidence she usually carried seemed softer now, stripped back to something raw and human. I hesitated, then said quietly, "I know what you mean." Her eyes shifted toward me, curious. "I mean, I'm young. Everyone tells me I have all this time to figure things out. But honestly, I don't feel like I know where I'm headed either. I'm trying things, moving forward, but most days it feels like I'm wandering more than walking." For a moment she studied me, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a soft laugh, not mocking, but almost relieved. "Wandering. That's exactly it." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, alive with the weight of what we'd both admitted. I looked at her then, really looked. At the way the porch light caught the lines around her eyes, not flaws, but markers of a life fully lived. At the steady way she held herself, even in uncertainty. And for the first time, I didn't just see her as the graceful neighbor with the teasing smile. I saw her as someone carrying a quiet ache, someone who, despite her poise, longed to be seen and understood. Our eyes met, and this time neither of us looked away. The moment stretched, fragile yet magnetic. My heart thudded harder, as though it wanted to fill the silence for me. Finally, she gave a small smile, not the playful kind she'd worn before, but something softer, almost bittersweet. "I didn't mean to get so heavy on you," she said. "I don't mind," I replied, my voice lower than I intended. "Actually, I'm glad you did." For a second, the air between us shifted. It wasn't just neighborly conversation anymore. It was connection, quiet, tentative, but undeniably real. She looked back toward her porch, then down at the tea in her hands. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle, almost to herself. "Maybe wandering doesn't feel so lonely when someone else admits they're wandering too." I swallowed, unable to stop the small smile that formed. "Yeah," I said. "Exactly that." The night seemed to hold its breath, and though nothing more happened, no touch, no sudden declarations, the bond had changed. What began as playful glances and teasing words was now something deeper, something I couldn't laugh off. And as I stood there beside her in the soft glow of the porch light, I knew this wasn't just a neighborly friendship anymore. It was the beginning of something neither of us had expected, but both of us clearly felt. It started with something ordinary. She waved me over one afternoon, calling out from her porch as I was unlocking my front door. "Hey," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes steady on mine. "Do you have a minute? I could use a little help." I nodded before I even knew what she needed. "Sure." She led me inside her house, a space I'd only ever glimpsed from the doorway. The moment I stepped in, I felt the difference. The air was cooler, touched with the faint scent of lavender and something warmer, her perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. The living room was cozy, lived in, stacks of books on the coffee table, a blanket draped casually over the arm of the couch, framed photos lying neatly on a shelf. She pointed toward a large box near the wall. "I've been meaning to move this for weeks. Thought I could handle it myself, but well, here we are." I crouched down, slid my arms under the box, and lifted. It wasn't heavy, but I could feel her eyes on me as I shifted it across the room. When I set it down, I turned back to find her standing a little closer than before, her mug of tea cradled in both hands. "Thanks," she said softly, almost like it was more than gratitude for moving a box. "No problem." I brushed my hands together, though they weren't dusty. "Anything to steady myself." She gestured for me to sit, insisting I take a break before heading back. I hesitated, just for a second, then sank onto the couch. The cushions dipped beneath me, familiar yet foreign, like I'd crossed into a space not meant to be entered lightly. She sat down too, not right beside me, but close enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. She leaned back, one leg tucked under the other, her body angled slightly toward mine. "You really didn't have to come over," she said, smiling faintly. I glanced at her, then away. I didn't mind. The truth was, I hadn't. I liked being here, in her world, surrounded by the little details that made her feel more real, more tangible than just the graceful figure I'd watched from across the yard. As we talked, about nothing and everything, I noticed the small things. The way she brushed a strand of hair from her face, fingers lingering against her temple. The way her foot tapped lightly against the floor when she was thinking. At one point, she reached for the box I'd moved, intending to open it. Without thinking, I leaned forward too, our hands meeting on the cardboard flap. For a heartbeat, either of us moved. Her fingers were warm against mine, soft, steady. She didn't pull back right away, and I didn't either. Finally, she laughed lightly, though her voice was quieter than usual. Guess that's what they mean by neighbors helping neighbors. I smiled, but my chest tightened at the weight behind her words. They were casual, but the way her eyes held mine told a different story. The room seemed smaller all of a sudden, the air thicker. I became aware of everything, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the faint rustle of the leaves outside, the soft glow of the lamp beside us. We sat back, but not as far as before. The space between us felt intentional now, charged in a way that made every glance, every shift of her hand, feel like something more. And though nothing more happened that afternoon, no kiss, no dramatic gesture, I knew a line had been crossed. It wasn't physical, not yet. But it was there, invisible and undeniable, the moment where, just neighbors, no longer fit. I walked out of her house later that day with the scent of lavender still clinging to me, the memory of her fingers brushing mine imprinted in my mind. And as I stepped into the fading light of the street, I realized I didn't just want to be her helpful neighbor anymore. I wanted to be something more. It happened on a day when the sky had been threatening rain all afternoon. Heavy clouds rolled in, darkening the air until the neighborhood seemed caught between daylight and dusk. I had been outside, trimming back the wild growth along my fence, when the first drops began to fall. "Come in before you get drenched," she called from her porch. I didn't hesitate. By the time I crossed the short stretch of yard, the rain had already quickened, fat drops scattering across my shoulders. She stepped back, holding the door open, and I slipped inside just as the downpour hit in full. The sound of it filled the room, a steady drum against the roof and windows, so strong it seemed to press the world beyond her walls into silence. "Guess you're stuck here for a while," she said, a smile playing at her lips. "I think I can survive that," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my pulse betrayed me. We ended up on the couch, the same one I'd sat on the other day. This time, though, the storm outside made the room feel more intimate, like we'd been sealed into a smaller world. The lamp glowed softly beside us, shadows flickering across the walls with each flash of distant lightning. She tucked her legs beneath her, angled slightly toward me, her bare foot brushing against the cushion near my thigh. I could feel the warmth of her presence in a way that made it impossible to focus on anything else. We talked, at first, about small things, movies she liked, the places she dreamed of traveling to, the funny quirks of living in a neighborhood where everyone seemed to know everything about everyone. Our laughter came easily, cutting through the steady patter of rain. But each laugh seemed to pull us a little closer. Every time her shoulder brushed mine, the contact lingered just a little too long. At one point, lightning flashed, followed by a rolling crack of thunder that rattled the windows. She flinched slightly, her hand reaching instinctively toward mine on the couch cushion. And she didn't pull away. Her fingers rested against mine, tentative at first, then steadier. I felt the warmth of her palm, the delicate press of her skin against my knuckles. It wasn't a full grasp, not yet, but it was more than enough to send my heartbeat racing. She looked at me then, her eyes soft, searching. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The storm filled the silence for us, and in that silence, everything else seemed to fade, the world outside, the reasons not to, the fear of what others might think. It was just us. I could see the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers trembling slightly as if betraying nerves she tried to hide. I noticed how close her knee was to mine, close enough that if I shifted even an inch, we'd be touching. I wanted to reach for her hand fully, to close that small gap and let her know I wasn't imagining this connection. But something in the way she glanced down, the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, told me not to rush. So I stayed still. I let her hand rest against mine, let the electricity hum in that fragile space between us, and simply breathed in the moment. When the thunder rolled again, she finally let out a soft laugh, as if breaking the spell we'd fallen under. "I don't usually have company during storms," she said, her voice quieter, almost thoughtful. "Then I'm glad I could be here," I answered, my words low, carrying more meaning than the sentence deserved. She looked at me again, really looked, and for a second, it felt like something might happen. Like the invisible wall we'd been skirting for days might finally dissolve. But then she leaned back just slightly, enough to reestablish the space between us, though her hands still lingered near mine. The storm raged on outside, but inside the room, the true storm was the one neither of us dared unleash. The rain eased after a while, softening from its furious downpour into a steady drizzle. The air inside her living room felt warmer, thicker, as though the storm had seeped into the walls and left behind a hum neither of us knew how to quiet. We were still on the couch, close enough that I could feel the faint brush of her sleeve against my arm whenever either of us shifted. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight, like a string stretched taut, waiting to snap or to sing. She was the one who broke it. "You know," her voice was soft, but steady, "this probably isn't a good idea." I turned my head, searching her profile in the lamplight. She wasn't looking at me. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where rivulets of rain streaked down the glass. Her hands were clasped in her lap, fingers worrying the edge of her sleeve. "What isn't?" I asked gently. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, as if giving the word's shape cost her something. "This. Us. Whatever it is we're doing." I let the silence stretch a beat longer before answering. "Are we doing something?" That made her glance at me, her lips curving into a rueful smile. "Don't play dumb. You know what I mean." Her eyes were steady now, but behind them was something else, conflict, fear, maybe even longing. "There's the age difference," she continued, almost briskly, as though listing excuses would keep her grounded. "There's what the neighbors would say. What people would think. Me, a woman in my 40s, and you." She broke off, shaking her head. "You should be figuring out your own life, not getting tangled up in mine." Her words should have stung, but they didn't. They sounded more like a shield she was holding up for both of us. I leaned forward slightly, my elbows resting on my knees, my voice low. "Do you really care what other people would say?" Her lips parted, but no answer came immediately. That hesitation was enough for me to press on. "Because I don't," I said. "I don't care what they'd think. The only thing I care about is you." Her breath caught, just barely. I saw it, the subtle rise of her shoulders, the flicker in her eyes. She looked at me like she was trying to decide whether to believe me, whether to let those words settle into the guarded places of her heart. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice quieter now, tinged with something raw. "I've spent years building this life, keeping things steady, respectable. Letting people see me a certain way. And then suddenly here you are, this young, stubborn neighbor who looks at me like what?" I asked, my chest tightening. She met my gaze fully then, and the vulnerability in her eyes nearly unraveled me. "Like I'm more than I let myself believe I am." The words hung between us, fragile and powerful all at once. I didn't move closer, not yet. Instead, I let the honesty settle, gave her the space to see that I wasn't rushing, wasn't trying to take something from her. I just wanted her to know she wasn't wrong. "Because you are," I said simply. "More than you think. More than I can put into words." For the first time that night, her guarded expression softened. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head as if at her own weakness. "You're going to ruin me," she murmured. I smiled faintly, though my heart was pounding. "Or maybe I'll remind you." The drizzle outside tapered off, leaving the world hushed, as if listening. We sat there in the after-storm stillness, our words hanging between us like a fragile bridge. She didn't reach for my hand this time, but she didn't pull away either. Her shoulders relaxed, her posture eased, and though the fears still lingered in her eyes, so did something else, a fragile hope she couldn't quite hide. And in that moment I knew we weren't pretending anymore. We had stepped past pretense, past casual smiles and lingering glances. Now, there was only honesty, and the quiet, unspoken question of what we would do with it. The storm had passed. The night outside her window was hushed, the world rinsed clean, carrying that particular freshness only rain could leave behind. From the couch, I could see the glow of the street lamps bouncing faintly off wet pavement, their light painting the room in shades of gold and shadow. We hadn't moved much. She sat back against the cushions, her arms folded loosely, not as a shield but in quiet thought. I sat beside her, not daring to intrude further, yet close enough that the warmth of her presence was undeniable. For a long while either of us spoke. The air was full of unspoken things, fragile but real. Then, finally, she let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. "You really don't make this easy, do you?" she said softly, her voice carrying a tired kind of affection. I turned my head, searching her expression in the gentle lamplight. "What do you mean?" Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes stayed serious. "Most people, they'd see the reasons not to. The lines not to cross. And here you are, looking at me like all those reasons don't exist." I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, my tone even but sure. "That's because they don't matter to me. Not compared to you." She tilted her head, studying me like she was still trying to measure the truth in my words. But she didn't argue this time. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "I don't remember the last time someone looked at me like that." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was softer, more fragile, like a first snowfall, delicate but certain. I reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. My hand brushed over hers, warm against warm, my thumb grazing the line of her knuckles. She glanced down at our joined hands, and for a second I thought she might retreat. But she didn't. She let me hold her hand, her fingers curling gently around mine. It was such a simple touch, yet it carried the weight of everything unsaid. When she finally looked back up at me, her eyes were softer than I'd ever seen them. "You're too young to know what you're getting yourself into," she murmured, though there was no sharpness in her tone, only concern, only vulnerability. I smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe I know exactly what I'm choosing." Her breath caught, and her eyes shimmered just slightly in the lamplight. I could see the struggle still lingering there, the doubts, the rules she'd lived by, the years she carried that I hadn't. But beneath all of that was something undeniable. The way she wanted to believe me, the way she wanted, just this once, to let herself lean into what she felt. She shifted closer, so subtly it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But I felt it, the inch of space narrowing, the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine. My chest tightened, my breath stilled, and before I could stop myself, my free hand lifted gently to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes closed at the touch. Just for a second, but long enough to let me know what it meant. When they opened again, she was already leaning toward me. And in that quiet, fragile moment, her lips brushed my cheek, a kiss so soft it barely lingered, yet it burned its way straight into me. She pulled back, just slightly, her smile small but real. "We'll see," she whispered, her voice carrying both caution and promise. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my thumb still tracing circles over her hand. "That's enough for me," I said. And I meant it. The night settled around us, calm and unhurried. Outside, the world was still glistening with rain, but inside, everything felt still, as if it had shifted into place. We didn't need to decide the future right then. We didn't need to name what was happening. All that mattered was the honesty between us, the quiet closeness, and the gentle certainty that something real had begun. And for now, that was more than enough. 25L